Happy Halloween, bitches. It is October, which is my favorite month of the year, in case you couldn't already tell. So of course, the nails are black, Ripley shirt is on, and the Spirit Halloween decorations are up. And of course, I've got my Scent from Hell burning. This is We're Going to Get You from Christy DeMeester's Etsy shop. We're going to be talking about one of her books today, so this is a nice synchronicity. I get to plug two of her products. I'm not in any way sponsored by her, but I absolutely love Scent from Hell. That's S-C-E-N-T, where Christy DeMeester makes her own candles, and they are all inspired by horror films and horror books. So this is the Evil Dead candle, which is why it's next to the cabin. This is a wonderful scent. It's very campfire-y. There's some pininess to it. You just feel like you were out in a cabin in the middle of the woods with some demons terrorizing you and your friends, which is the vibe that I like to bring to my apartment personally. So again, that is Christy DeMeester's Scent from Hell. This is the We're Going to Get You candle. I don't know if there are any left in stock. They tend to go pretty quick, but do check out her Etsy shop because it's fantastic. All of her scents are incredibly layered. She does all of them herself and always has a personalized thank you note. So yeah, if you want to support a horror author in a way more than just buying their books, that's a great way to do it. So of course it's the beginning of the month, and hopefully I actually get this posted at the beginning of the month. I'm recording earlier than I usually do, so hopefully that'll help. But I'm going to be talking today about everything I read back in September, and everything that I plan to read in October, which is quite a lot, and actually I've got some themed TBR this month. So we'll get into that at the end of the video, but first, here is my reading wrap-up for September 2022. I kicked off the month with a bang, which is a double entendre, with a Richard Lehman doubleheader, The Woods Are Dark and Beware. The Woods Are Dark was everything I wanted Richard Lehman to be. I really enjoyed this seller, but it's a very strange book in his back catalog, I'm now kind of learning, because it's not very horror-centric. It's much more erotic than it is scary. The actual horror set pieces are few and far between, but The Woods Are Dark is a completely different story. This was his second published novel. He did write under a variety of pseudonyms, so The Woods Are Dark wasn't technically his second book, but it is the second Richard Lehman book. The original publication was butchered and basically ruined his career in America before he got kind of picked up in the UK and people started reading his stuff over there. And so I read the restored edition that was done by his daughter. I really enjoyed reading about the process for which she kind of put together all of the different versions of the manuscript to bring the version of The Woods Are Dark that Richard Lehman wanted us to read. Of course, several years after his passing, so he never did get to see that publication, which is quite sad. But The Woods Are Dark is fantastic. It is sort of his off-season, but there is sort of a vaguely supernatural angle to it that you don't get in the Jack Ketchum off-season book. It is just a rip-roaring 200-page thriller. It's never boring. It starts from a place of insanity and it ends in a place of insanity. It is incredibly fun to read. It does have everything that you would expect from a Richard Lehman novel. It is deeply sexually explicit. There's a lot of sexual assault, so be warned. I don't think anyone should read Richard Lehman if you're sensitive to sexual assault or iffy about whether that should be portrayed in fiction. Just stay away. The violence is off the charts. There's a ridiculous body count in this book. It was shocking, it was funny. There was some surprising inclusion of bisexuality, which was pretty cool. I actually did feel that this was a well-written novel, which is not something that I can say about the seller. There are some really interesting characters, some of them are likable, and some of them add a little bit more depth to the story than you might think. You have the father character whose name is Lander Dills. Come on, Richard. And he starts off the book as this very, typical American who's taking his his wife and daughter and his daughter's boyfriend on a camping trip or some road trip before they get sidetracked and thrust into this bizarre situation where they're having to fight for their lives. And he doesn't stay that upstanding, all-American dad for very long. He very quickly devolves into his most brutish instincts, and I thought that was really interesting, that this is a book that you place normal people in a ridiculous situation, and you kind of get to see layers stripped away, and you get to see their deepest desires. And that's something that you see a lot in books like this. The Troop by Nick Cutter also comes to mind as one where the breakdown of social dynamics kind of becomes a breeding ground for cruelty and violence. And that's front and center in The Woods Are Dark. It is a book with some thematic heft. It is, at the end of the day, still a cannibal horror book that has a lot of sex and violence in it, but it does have a little bit more under the surface, and so I would say it is easily my favorite Richard Lehman book I've read so far, but I haven't read too many. And then we get to Beware, which is maybe one of my favorite covers. I love that. And this is a very, very strange book. It follows an invisible man, and it is a Richard Lehman story about an invisible man, so he does some pretty horrific things. The first quarter of this book was really, really rough, and I think it's done as sensitively as Lehman could do it. Of course, you have this just monstrous invisible man invading a woman's home and doing horrible things to her multiple times, and it actually does, it follows this character. She is the protagonist of the story, and it does deal with the aftermath of that trauma. The narrative is not kind to her at all. The first sort of chunk of the book is where most of the really rough stuff happens. Once more characters are introduced and the story becomes a little bit wider, you get more of a fun invisible man story with some weird secret society shit going on too. It's a very odd book. I really enjoyed how it started. The first couple chapters were great. You think it's going to be kind of a haunting story. There's a supermarket where meat cleavers are flying through the air, which is of course the invisible man doing it, but that's not where your brain goes at first. There's also this blood-drinking orgy cult that was really weird and cool, and the way that chapter was described was deeply sexy. All the ingredients are there. It's got all the Richard Lehman stuff, the violence, the sex, the violent sexual violence that's really tough to stomach, but does make it a disturbing and frightening read. I mean, this is a horror novel, first and foremost. I didn't love it, but I did enjoy it for the most part, and it was a quick read. It's one of his shorter books, kind of in the middle on this one. It was fine, I enjoyed it. Next, I read Crossed by Garth Ennis and Jason Burrows. This was the first volume, the only one I think that Garth Ennis did beginning to end, and yeah, it is fucked up. This is functionally a zombie story, even though they're not really zombies. They're humans who are still alive and still kind of retain something of the person that they were. This virus basically shuts off their filter, so they do whatever depraved things they can think of. I enjoyed it very much. I found it very dark, and it does get into some interesting philosophical stuff towards the end. I wanted a little bit more meat to it, which I might get from reading any of the other ridiculous amount of Crossed there is out there. I did feel, for how it's been talked up to me, that it was somewhat more tame than I expected, but there's some very conceptually disgusting things that happen that don't really come across visually so much as just the thought of them happening is really, really upsetting. It's drawn in a way that doesn't feel overly pornographic when it's getting into the more disgusting stuff. I really don't have too much to say about Crossed. It wasn't the most substantial reading experience for me, but I did enjoy it, and there were a few chapters that really got to me. It is great extreme horror. I wish there was more. I wish there was more to it and more of it, but there is a lot of it. So I'm definitely going to be picking up as much Crossed as I can find. And I also am curious to read Preacher, which is also by Garth Ennis. I recommend it if you can stomach it. Since there is a visual component, that may add a little bit more intensity for some people to the extreme stuff. For me, it actually took away a little bit. I get more freaked out from reading lengthy descriptions of things, and it's about the descriptions of the pain that characters are going through that really gets to me personally. For people who have a hard time with visuals, I would avoid it, but if you like extreme horror, I would definitely check out Crossed if you haven't already. I know it's pretty popular, but yeah, it was great. And then I read Such a Pretty Smile by Christy DeMeester, and I wasn't really super excited for this, since it is a more contemporary, and I've been sort of moving away from that the more I read this year. And the reviews were a bit mixed. I know a lot of people were super excited for this before it came out, and then when it did, it kind of seemed to fall flat for a lot of people, and I've had it sitting on my shelf since pretty soon after it came out, and I just never got around to it. So I finally read it this month, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. This is a very dreamy psychological horror. I think if you're expecting a werewolf story out of this, or some kind of creature feature, not really gonna get that. It is very unsettling. The best thing I can think of to compare sort of the style of horror that you get in this book, what my mind kept going back to is Candyman, which is one of my absolute favorite films. I love Candyman deeply. It's like people losing time and going into a frenzy and building a sculpture, and when it's done, you look up and you realize that 4 hours have passed and you didn't remember doing it. That's the kind of thing that really kind of upsets me and freaks me out, and there's a lot of that here. It's structured very much like Sundial by Katrina Ward, which I wasn't the biggest fan of. I didn't hate it, but it didn't really work for me. This is a very similar book. This is like Sundial done right for me, because it is, you know, it's telling one story from the perspective of the child, and the other story from the perspective of her mother back, you know, however many years ago. And that's exactly how Sundial is structured. It depicts adolescence very, very well. One of the main characters here, the daughter, is struggling to come out to her mother and has fallen for this girl who is not great and is not gonna like her back, and doesn't treat her very well. I really connected to some of it. I mean, it is very much a story about femininity and young girls, so I don't have any sort of personal connection to that aspect of it, but the queer character struggling with their sexuality, that I can definitely relate to, and the treatment of mental illness in this is really upsetting and realistic. The writing's very good. I have to say it's not really like the highlight of this book. For me, it was the story and the characters that really came alive. Not so much the writing, but it is, you know, it's well written, it's readable, and I flew through it. It was a really, really great read. One of the bigger surprises of the year for me. I didn't think I was gonna love this as much as I did, but I really did. Pick yourself up a copy of Such a Pretty Smile if you haven't already, and get a candle to go with it. Give Christy DeMeester your money. She deserves it. And finally, a truly impactful book to me, and to many people I know, The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. This is a well, this is an ocean. It's hilarious to me that this is a leisure horror book, because it transcends that for me. It transcends extreme horror, it transcends splatterpunk. Like, to call this splatterpunk would be, I think, false. It was incredibly difficult to read. Even just like picking it up and talking about it, I just want to put it down and go lay down and cry. It is one of the most effective and empathetic studies on cruelty, suffering, domination, the veneer of 50s suburbia, and just the unimaginable monstrousness that children are capable of when they don't have an adult to mediate it, and when that adult is complicit and is encouraging it. It is so frustrating to read, and you keep having to remind yourself that this happened. This is a toned down version of something that a real girl went through, and you know, that can so easily turn to exploitation. This is not exploitation. This is revelation. This is just laying out for the world the terrible suffering someone went through, and saying, look at how ugly this is, and know that it's happening. It crushed me. The character of Ruth, who in the book is an aunt of Meg, Meg, of course, being the insert for Sylvia Likens, the real victim in this true crime case. So Ruth is Meg's aunt, and her caregiver, and the one who just is slipping into madness and cruelty. She is one of the most vile and repugnant villains I've ever read about, and she's a real villain. She existed. In the afterword for this, Jack Ketchum talks about how this sort of stuff is what makes him mad, and that fury really comes through. The anger at the futility of this, that no one stopped this, that the warning signs were there and no one stepped in and stopped it. It's just so crushing. I truly believe that you can't read this without coming out the other end a better person. As much a study on cruelty, it's a study on empathy, understanding that you will never understand the suffering of another person. And it's also a commentary on being a bystander to violence. At what point do you stop being a bystander and start being a willing participant? And does the weight of all of that inaction continue to matter if you do choose to do something about it, or does it not? Does nothing erase that? Easily one of the best books I have ever read. I loved it so deeply. It destroyed me, and then it put me back together again, and made me look at the world a little bit differently. And I think that's what the best art does. This is art. This is such a monumentally beautiful novel. Even for people who don't read extreme horror, if you think there's any chance you can stomach this without being traumatized by it, I think it's something that most people should read. Like I said, it's a study on empathy. It will make you a better person, but it will not be easy. That's all I'm gonna say about The Girl Next Door today. Because I don't want to just cry on camera, but what a monumental achievement of fiction. So that's actually it for what I read in September. I know I didn't read quite as much this past month, but I really picked up towards the end for me with those last two books. I really loved them. Time for a little palate cleanser with my Halloween Horror TBR. You will never catch me saying spooky season. I read horror year-round, so how can I tailor my horror reading to Halloween specifically? And I decided it would be fun to do a book representing each sort of classic Halloween monster. Not all of them, because I don't have that much time in the month. For a vampire story, I went back and forth, because this one is long, but I think I just need to read it since I haven't read a lot of vampire fiction. This is one of the tentpoles. Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I really hope this doesn't take most of the month, but it probably will, because it's a bit of a thick one. But yes, very excited to read this. I haven't read much Stephen King, but what I have read I really loved, so I don't doubt that this, which is considered one of his better works, I don't doubt I will really, really like it. And of course I need a ghost story, so The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Recently this was adapted to the second season of Mike Flanagan's Netflix series, The Haunting of Bly Manor, which I did enjoy, but I much prefer The Innocents, which was the adaptation from the 60s. One of the most frightening films I have ever seen, with some fantastic child performances. So I'm very familiar with the story of The Turn of the Screw. I have just never read the original text, and I'm only about a chapter in, and it's going to be a challenge. I don't read a lot that's written in this older English, so I don't know if it's going to be a favorite, but it's short, so I'm going to try to get through it quick. And then I need a witch story, and this one was a no-brainer. Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery by Brom. This is such a gorgeous book. I've had it for quite a while and just stare at it because, my god, it's so beautifully presented. And of course, it includes illustrations of the characters. Brom is known as an artist more than anything, but also I've heard is a pretty good writer, so I'm very excited to read this. It's a little bit more fantastical, I think, than what I normally read, but that sort of dark witchcraft Salem vibe is definitely up my alley, and I think I'm really gonna enjoy this one. And then a werewolf story, The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Andor. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I know nothing about this other than it's a pretty seminal work in the world of werewolf literature. I don't read a lot of werewolf stuff, in case you haven't noticed, so I'm interested to see whether this will really work for me or if it'll just kind of confirm that werewolves are not really my thing. Still, I needed to get a werewolf story in there, so we got one. And a zombie story, of course. How could I not go with The Rising by Brian Keene, his first novel. I'm very excited to read this. I did enjoy the other Brian Keene book I read, and this is one of his most well regarded, and there is also a sequel. We'll see if I really love this. I may just dive in and make that my first read of November. I do just have two other sort of freebies. One is one that I started last month and have been kind of slowly picking my way through, Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. Yeah, I'm not too far in, and it's already put me through the ringer. There's stuff that I've loved and stuff that I've just hated. So I'm interested to see what my final verdict on this is gonna be, but my first time reading Chuck Palahniuk, and I kind of wish I'd chosen a different one to start with, but we're in it now. And my other freebie is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. I just wanted to get through this real quick before the new Hellraiser movie comes out that I'm super excited for. I'm only 20 pages in, and already I have fallen in love. This is fabulous. Again, my first Clive Barker. So that does it for my October TBR. I hope you have the best, the most grotesque Halloween. I will probably be doing an all-day horror movie marathon on the day like I usually do, unless I'm working. But I will just be watching horror movies all month and reading horror books all month and just basking in this wonderful, wonderful time of year. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please get in touch, comment below. Thank you to those of you who have been commenting. I love hearing what you all have to say and getting recommendations, so please do feel free to comment, and I will see you next time. We'll see if I can fit in another video, just since it's that time of year. I feel like I should be putting a little more out there. But until then, I will see you next time. I am the composer next door. Goodbye.